good evening, and welcome. If you found yourself here, perhaps you're searching for something quiet, something slow, a place where the flicker of history can warm the silence of the night. If this kind of storytelling soothes your thoughts, feel free to leave a like and subscribe. It helps more than you think. Now, let's begin. Imagine a darkness without end. Not the comfortable darkness of a modern evening, softened by lamplight or screens, but a much heavier kind. A darkness that seeps into the bones of the world, thick, wide, and almost alive. A darkness that arrives not just with nightfall, but with the very turn of the season, the medieval winter. The last leaf has long since let go of the branch. The ground is stiff beneath layers of ice and soil, and the sun, once strong, once golden, now drags itself across the sky like a half-extinguished ember, barely rising before it begins to fall again. It is the year 1327. We are in a village that has no name on any map, you know. A forgotten place, too small for glory, too poor for war. Thatched roofs weighed down with snow, smoke curling upward like old breath, vanishing into the grayness above. Everything is silent here except for the wind, and sometimes the wolves. The people, they are not quite starving, not yet. But the food is low, always low. Root vegetables wrapped in dirt-stiff linen, hung from rafters to keep them from mice. Barley bread, hard as stone unless softened in broth. And even the broth, these days, is thin. A few bones, a few herbs that taste more like dust than flavor. Salted fish if you're lucky, a rat if you're not. Inside one of the cottages, no wider than your living room, a fire whispers in the hearth. The walls are timber, smeared with old soot, their joints stuffed with straw and clay. Everything smells of smoke, wool, and sweat, and something else, a kind of rot, low and sour, that clings to the back of the nose. It's in the floorboards, it's in the clothes, the simply part of winter. A girl sits near the fire, no more than 10 years old. Her hands are red with cold, fingertips cracked and swollen. She holds a bit of wool, carded rough and not yet spun. Her job to keep it clean before her older sister makes it into thread. Her breath fogs the air even indoors, and every few moments she rubs her palms together as if trying to remember what warmth used to feel like. Their father sleeps nearby or tries to. He coughs sometimes, not deeply, but enough that her mother glances over with that expression people wear when they've seen illness before and hope this isn't the start of it. No one speaks of it. Illness, in winter, is an unkind guest. It rarely leaves alone. Outside, the snow has begun to fall again. Not thickly, not yet, but with a soft, almost curious rhythm. It taps against the shutters, collects on the frozen thatch. Somewhere far off, a dog barks once, and then falls silent. Underneath it all, there's a waiting, a heaviness. Not fear exactly, something older than fear. A kind of resignation that comes from knowing there is no escape from the season, only endurance. And yet, even now, life stirs. In the manor at the hill's edge, barely visible through the white, a candle glows behind oiled parchment windows. The Lord is awake. His chambers are warmer, yes, but the wind creeps even there. Stone is stone. It drinks the heat and gives nothing back. He sits at a long table with a goosefeather quill, scratching out a list of dues. Grain, wool, firewood. The peasants below must give, though they have nothing left to offer. A ledger keeps the world turning, even when the world seems to be stopping. His steward brings wine, spiced and steaming in a pewter cup. And for a moment, a flicker of comfort, cinnamon, cloves, the memory of harvest. But it's an illusion. Even for the Lord, the cold comes in. Even for the Lord, the food may not last. There is less coming in from the south, fewer carts, fewer coins. The roads are frozen. Bandits roam. Trust breaks easily in winter. He listens to the fire crackle, to the wind. Somewhere, a beam creaks as snow settles on the roof above. And there, in that sound, just for an instant, is the suggestion of something else. Not a voice, not quite, but a presence, as if the winter itself is listening back. But there is no time for such thoughts. He pulls his cloak tighter and calls for another log. Back in the village, a boy trudges through the snow with a basket of kindling. His feet are wrapped in cloth instead of shoes, soaked through and freezing. Each step is a decision. Each breath is a struggle not to cough. His cheeks are raw, chapped white at the edges. But he doesn't cry. He can't. The tears would freeze on his skin. He passes the chapel, a crooked wooden structure half swallowed by drifts. Inside, a single candle still burns beneath a carved image of Christ, arms outstretched not in welcome, but in warning. The priest is asleep, or perhaps praying. It's hard to tell. The boy does not stop to look. Somewhere beyond the fields, deep in the woods, something moves. A cracking branch, a low howl, or maybe nothing at all. But people here know not to go far after nightfall. The cold takes more than warmth. It steals sound, direction, sense. Many have vanished this way, lost among trees that all look the same when the snow lays its silence over them. In this world, the cold is not a backdrop. It is a character. It is a force. It comes not just to chill the skin, but to test the soul. To wait at the edge of each breath, whispering, "Not all of you will see the thaw." And somewhere, perhaps in that same nameless village or another just like it, there is an old woman, alone, wrapped in rags, her hands curled like roots. She does not speak anymore, but her eyes are still sharp. They have seen many winters, and she has learned to listen to them. In this world, the cold is not a backdrop. It is a character. It is a force. It comes not just to chill the skin, but to test the soul. To wait at the edge of each breath, whispering, "Not all of you will see the thaw." And somewhere, perhaps in that same nameless village or another just like it, there is an old woman, alone, wrapped in rags, her hands curled like roots. She does not speak anymore, but her eyes are still sharp. They have seen many winters, and she has learned to listen to them. Because the cold, the real cold, doesn't just come from the wind. Sometimes it comes from what the snow covers, what lies beneath it, and what waits for the spring never to come. The snow continued to fall through the night, soft at first, like dust shaken loose from some celestial rafters, then heavier, more determined. By morning, the village roofs were buried in white, edges rounded, chimneys barely poking through like forgotten thoughts in a deep sleep. No one truly slept, though. Sleep in winter was a thin and fractured thing. It came in fragments, in fits between the creaks of freezing timber, between the rustle of rats in the walls, between the coughs and stirrings and long stretches of silence where you listened too carefully to your own breath. In the morning, there was no dawn, not really. Just a thickening of gray behind the clouds, the color of ashes or dirty wool. The men rose first, slowly, their joints stiff, knees cracking, backs hunched from years of work and months of cold. They didn't speak much. There was little to say. Each movement was a quiet negotiation with pain. Boots pulled on with numb fingers. Woolen tunics dragged over sore shoulders. A single candle sputtered in the corner, and the smoke from the hearth hung low, unwilling to rise, as if even fire had grown tired. A boy stood near the door, blowing into his hands. He was meant to help his father today, chopping wood from the frostbitten logs behind the house. But the axe was old, the handle splintered, the blade dulled from too many winters. The forest where they gathered timber was 3 fields away, and getting there meant a walk through snow that reached the thigh in places, and deeper still where the drifts had settled in the night. Outside, the world was silent. Snow has a way of burying sound, of folding it inward. You could scream in a blizzard, and no one would ever hear. Not because you were far, but because the cold would swallow the sound before it even left your lips. That day, the boy and his father made it to the woods. They took the old sled, a crude plank lashed to bent iron runners, and a length of rope. The trees stood waiting, dark and narrow and tall, like thin silhouettes in a half-remembered dream. Their branches sagged with snow. No birds, no rustling, just stillness. But deep inside the forest, the snow is different. It doesn't fall in flakes. It drips, slow, from limbs to moss, from moss to stone. And beneath that, beneath everything, is the ground that never thaws. They chopped in silence. Each swing of the axe rang out with a dull, wet thunk. The boy watched his father's breath rise in great plumes and thought, strangely, of ghosts. He wondered if the forest remembered all those who had once come here and never gone back. They dragged 2 logs home. Not much, but enough to keep the fire alive one more night. Not enough for all of winter, but enough for now. Back in the village, others were stirring. The baker's wife opened the shutters to let out the smoke. Her arms were covered in flour and ash, and her hair was tied up in a kerchief stiff with sweat and soot. She had been awake since before the light came, kneading the coarse barley dough with aching wrists. There was barely enough yeast left. Most had frozen in the early frost and never revived. The loaves were flat and heavy, but they were warm, and in winter warmth was half the hunger. Near the edge of the village, the blacksmith struggled to relight his forge. The bellows wheezed. The coals smoked but did not glow. He muttered under his breath, curses muffled by his frozen beard, and eventually gave up, settling for wrapping his fingers around the iron poker just to feel something. Even iron refused to bend in winter. It was too brittle, too stubborn, like the people. Above all, what winter demanded was patience and silence. You could not fight it, not really. You could only submit and wait and endure. But not everyone did. Every winter, someone would vanish. A shepherd who wandered too far while searching for a lost ewe. A young mother who never returned from the woods where she went to gather pine cones. A child who followed something, a light, a sound, a shape, into the white and never came back. Some said it was wolves. Others whispered of spirits, of old gods buried in the snow, restless and angry. No one agreed on what was real, but all agreed that it was better not to ask questions when someone disappeared. And this winter, the disappearances had begun early. A boy from the northern field. His mother said he was only going to fetch water from the stream, not far, just beyond the trees. He never returned. The next day, only his boot was found, half buried in ice, with the leather torn and twisted as if something had pulled from beneath. They said nothing. They buried the boot, and the silence grew deeper. Inside the chapel, the priest lit a stick of resinous incense. The air filled with sharp, pine-like smoke, curling around the carved saints like questions. The priest's hands trembled slightly as he crossed himself. He had seen the snow take people before. He had buried more in winter than in all other seasons combined. The bodies were never warm when he found them, their eyes always open. Some said that was the true cruelty of winter, not the dying, but the awareness of it. That cold sharpens the mind before it dulls it. That you know it's coming, that you feel every moment of it, until you don't. In the manner, the Lord read a letter. The seal was broken, the wax cracked in transit, the script uneven, a rushed hand. It spoke of trouble in the south. Roads blocked, brigands taking tolls, a caravan of salted meat lost in a storm. He frowned, drank his wine, and ordered the steward to inventory the stores again. They would not last. They never lasted. The winter always outweighed you, and somewhere, just outside the village, on a path half buried in white, there stood a figure, wrapped in a long gray cloak, hood up, hands gloved. The figure did not move. It had been standing there since dawn, watching the village, silent as stone. No one saw them arrive. No one saw them leave. Only one child, a girl near the edge of sleep, curled beside the hearth, thought she saw something when the wind shifted the curtain. Just a shape tall and still where no shape should be. She blinked once, and it was gone. She told no one. Winter doesn't like stories. It likes secrets, and it keeps them well. By the third week of snow, even time began to change. It no longer passed in days, hours, or moments, but in small, repetitive rituals that blurred together like footsteps in a drifting path. The crackling of the fire, the creak of the door, the whisper of wind against the shutters. You counted the light by the number of candles you dared to burn. You measured the cold by how close you had to sit to the coals before your skin began to sting instead of ache. And sometimes, nothing happened at all. Not the kind of peaceful nothing modern minds might imagine. A soft stillness, a pause for rest. No, this was a deeper, older kind of nothing. A waiting, a watching, like the world itself was holding its breath. In that stillness, even the youngest began to notice things. The way the animals stopped moving at once without cause. The way a shadow crossed the window, though no one passed. The way frost formed not just on the outside of the glass, but inside too, curling, strange, like script from a forgotten language, dissolving when touched. The boy, the one who'd gathered kindling with cloth-wrapped feet, now coughed in his sleep. A small sound, but regular. Each time, his mother turned toward him with that soft, motionless glance mothers learn when they are too tired for fear, but still carry it anyway. She would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, not from dreams, but from silence. True silence. So complete, so consuming that it felt unnatural. She would lie still then, listening. Not for her children, not for the wind, but for something else. Presence she could not name. As if something stood just beyond the threshold of hearing, waiting to be noticed. In the woods beyond the village, the snow had grown so deep that some of the older trees groaned under the weight. Branches cracked and fell, slow and sudden all at once, sending birds, few that remained, fluttering in spirals of confusion. Underneath the snow, the earth pulsed with ice. Roots froze. Streams slowed until they ran no more. No one went out unless they had to. Even the animals stayed hidden. Deer huddled deep in the thickets, noses buried in their own fur, and the foxes vanished entirely. Only the crows stayed. They sat in the trees near the chapel, black against white, still as stone, watching. The priest had started ringing the bell again, not for mass but for warning. Just once in the morning, a low sound that carried strangely far through the cold air, flattening as it moved across the hills. No one said why the bell rang. No one asked, but they all heard it. Inside the cottages, meals were now taken in silence. Bread broken, broth sipped. Sometimes a beet, sometimes a shriveled apple, kept too long in a cloth sack near the hearth, now soft and brown and cloyingly sweet. There was no feasting in a true winter. Even the lords dined sparingly. The manor's great hall, once the site of occasional gatherings, births, names, marriages, now lay mostly empty. Only 2 candles burned. The hearth was half dead. The long table bore nothing but a wedge of hard cheese, an untouched knife, and a single goblet of mulled wine, cooling slowly in the dim. The lord sat alone. His steward had fallen ill 2 nights ago. Feverish, incoherent, he'd been taken to the servants' quarters. No physician could be summoned. The roads were gone, hidden under wind and white. Even the riders had refused. "I've seen worse," the lord muttered, but his voice sounded unsure, even to him. He stared at the fire, not to warm himself, but to watch it, as if waiting for it to change. Sometimes the flames whispered. He did not say this aloud. Below, in the village, the blacksmith was losing his hearing. He didn't tell anyone, but the ringing in his ears, once a side effect of hammering iron day after day, had turned into something else. Something sharper, quieter, stranger. It wasn't a ringing anymore. It was a tone. A high, thin sound, just at the edge of perception. Came only when the snow was heaviest. Only when no one else was near. And when it came, he felt watched. Not in the way of spies or neighbors or even beasts. Watched like a mouse is watched. Like a candle is watched by the wind. But what could he do? The forge was cold. The iron waited. And there were tools to mend, hinges to fix, old horseshoes to hammer flat and resell as scrap. You worked. You endured. That was the rule. The old woman, the one who rarely spoke and never left her corner, had not eaten in 3 days. Her family assumed she was near the end. They spoke softly around her, tried not to disturb her when she stared into the hearth for hours without blinking. But she was not dying. Not exactly. She was remembering, because long ago, when she was still a child, when her hair was gold and not gray, when her bones did not ache and her breath came easy, There had been another winter like this. She'd nearly forgotten it. But now, with the snow so thick, and the nights so long, it came back to her. A night when the dogs would not bark. When the wind sang in a voice no one could name. When all the candles went out at once. And the next morning, 3 houses were empty. No doors broken. No tracks in the snow. Just empty. And it was not the first time, they said then. Nor would it be the last. She wanted to tell someone. She tried once. But her voice cracked, and no one listened. So she stayed silent, and watched the frost form on the inside of the window, and wondered what would go missing this year. The days had stopped changing, or so it seemed. No more distinction between morning and dusk, only shifting tones of gray. The light came not in beams, but in veils, as though the sky no longer rose but hovered just above the village, smothering everything in its hush. Inside the homes, the hearths burned low. Not for lack of need, no, the cold was deeper than ever, but because wood was running out. The stacks behind each cottage, once proud and carefully arranged in rows, were now pitiful heaps. Damp, half-rotten, sometimes covered in hoarfrost. Fire became precious. People sat closer to it now, leaning in, sometimes too far, noses red, sleeves singed. You could always tell the youngest children by the blackened edges of their tunics, the ones who leaned too close, too often, trying to feel something other than the chill that sat like a stone at the center of their chests. But even fire has its limits. There are corners of every house the warmth does not reach. Dark, low corners where mice scurry, where forgotten tools lie cold to the touch, where straw shifts under unseen weight at night. And it is there, sometimes, that people swear they hear movement, just barely, just enough to make them sit up. Not loud, not threatening, but deliberate. A scrape, a breath, a hush, and then nothing. They never found anything, of course. Nothing to see, nothing to catch, just the deepening quiet. The boy with the cloth-wrapped feet had stopped speaking. His mother said it was the fever, that it had settled in his throat, that he would speak again soon. But the girl, his sister, she knew better. She had seen the way his eyes looked past them, not through them but beyond them, as if there was something else in the room with them, something only he could see. He was not afraid, not quite. He was listening. One night, while their parents slept, she woke to the sound of breathing that was not his. It was slow, deep, measured. It came from beneath the floorboards. She did not move. She did not breathe. And after some time, it stopped. In the morning, the boy's fever had broken. His skin was slick with sweat. His lips cracked, but he was no longer shivering. The mother wept with relief. They called it a blessing. The girl said nothing. In the forest, snow had covered all trace of paths. Even the deer trails were gone, erased by wind and time. Only those who knew the trees by memory could still navigate, and even they were hesitant. The blacksmith, desperate for a fallen branch or two, ventured out with a neighbor. They did not return before dark, and by morning only the neighbor returned. Alone. He claimed the blacksmith had fallen through ice, that they had gone too close to the creek, and the water, hidden beneath a crust of snow, had opened like a mouth. He said he tried to pull him back, but the cold was too fast. No one questioned it, but some noticed his boots were dry, and his hands not red from cold but scratched. The Lord heard of it, of course. Everything reached the manor eventually, like smoke curling upward. He stood in his chamber, staring out across the frozen hills, the glass of his window fogged from within. He didn't react, not visibly. But later that day, he ordered the chapel bell not to be rung again. No explanation, just a command. The priest obeyed. He always obeyed. But that night, when the bell did not toll, the village felt it. A kind of absence, like a note missing in a song, as if the air had grown stiller somehow. And with that stillness came dreams. People began to speak of them, softly, reluctantly. Dreams of walking in endless snow, of being unable to turn back, of seeing figures just ahead, distant, still waiting but never reaching them. Dreams of knocking at doors and hearing their own voices answer from within. Dreams of warmth that felt wrong, that pressed too close against the skin like breath on the neck. And always, always, the sound of footsteps behind them, too slow to be pursued, too constant to ignore. One woman refused to sleep altogether. She sat by the fire, day and night, her hands wrapped around a rosary worn smooth with prayer. Her lips moved in silence. Her eyes stayed wide. She would not speak of what she saw, but she never stepped outside again, not even to fetch water. The old woman, the one who remembered the other winter. She watched this unfold with a heavy stillness. She said nothing, but in her lap, she held a length of twine, thick, braided, knotted at both ends. No one asked why. Perhaps they were afraid to know. On the third night without the bell, the snow fell straight and fast, without wind, as though poured from the sky by invisible hands. It buried everything: fences, tracks, firewood, and in the morning, a barn near the edge of the village collapsed under the weight. No one had heard it fall. Inside were 2 goats, gone. No blood, no bones, no fur, just gone. The villagers dug through the snow in silence. No one spoke, no one asked, but they all looked toward the woods, toward that line of trees that seemed to have crept a little closer this year. Just a little. The trees, too, were watching. The 5th week passed beneath a ceiling of unbroken gray. That dull, unmoving sky that seemed less like a roof above the world and more like a lid, slowly pressing downward with the weight of silence. The kind of silence that doesn't soothe or settle, but stretches, too long, too wide, until it begins to hum in the bones like a distant tremor. The kind you can't name but still feel behind your ribs when the fire dies down and the world becomes a still pool of waiting. By now, every cupboard had been opened too many times, every root cellar scraped, every dry crust softened in broth made from bones that had already given up their flavor. Hunger, once a discomfort, had become a daily companion. Constant, familiar, no longer shocking. It moved through the village like another wind. Invisible, patient, and cruel. The children were the first to show it. Their cheeks grew pale, not from cold alone but from the thinning of blood, the body's quiet retreat from its own edges. They no longer ran in play, no longer chattered or quarreled. They sat, mostly, watching the fire or tracing shapes in the ash with fingers too slow to finish what they started. Their laughter, when it came, sounded like it belonged to someone else. The girl with the brother who had stopped speaking now walked to the edge of the forest each day, not far enough to enter, never far enough to lose sight of the village roofs, but close enough to listen. She would stand beneath a leaning tree that creaked with every passing gust, its bark split and blackened by lightning long ago, and she would tilt her head as though hearing something beneath the wind, something deeper and older than sound itself. She had begun to hum to herself, low, tuneless, without rhythm, and her mother, though worn from worry, had decided not to stop her. Better a quiet song than quiet eyes. Elsewhere, the priest had started waking in the night to the smell of earth. Not smoke, not candle wax, not the tang of dried herbs from the altar, but earth, damp, rich, unyielding, like the scent of graves opened too soon or not quite closed. He would sit up in the dark, cold sweat gluing his linen shirt to his skin, and he would look toward the corner of the chapel where the floor had begun to bow, where the stone beneath the wooden planks had cracked sometime during the frost's first hard arrival, and where now, despite all logic, despite all prayer, a small curl of moss had appeared. He said nothing. He swept it away each morning before light touched the altar, but each night it returned. At the manor, the Lord no longer left his upper chamber. He'd taken to eating alone beside the window when he ate at all. The servants noticed the change in him. Not illness, precisely, but distance. As though some part of him had gone ahead into a season that had not yet arrived, and what remained behind was merely a reflection cast in the glass. He no longer asked for wine, no longer dictated letters. He simply sat, watching the line of trees in the far distance, that black fringe at the edge of the world that now seemed, somehow, not fixed in place, but approaching. The steward had died 2 days prior. No ceremony, no tolling bell, just a wrapped form buried beneath snow too deep to dig. They marked the spot with a pitchfork thrust upright, its tines bent from years of use, now resembling a gesture rather than a tool. No one wept. Weeping had grown rare. Even the dogs had stopped howling. There was one, however, an old creature with a torn ear and a clouded eye, that still lingered near the butcher's barn, though the butcher himself had vanished a week ago. They said he went looking for game in the higher hills, but no one had seen movement on the slopes since the last snowfall, and the dog, too lean, too alert, refused to leave the barn door, even though it hung loose from one hinge and swayed with a hollow sound in the wind. Sometimes the dog barked at nothing. No one stopped it. One morning, a man who had lived alone in the farthest house on the edge of the fields came into the village barefoot, with his hair frozen in strange spirals and his eyes unfocused, like he was still dreaming something no one could wake him from. He didn't speak. His mouth opened, yes, but no words came. Just a dry rasp, and then a low murmur, like the wind whispering through reeds at the edge of a lake. When the villagers approached him, gently, with blankets and broth, he turned his head slowly, as though hearing a voice only he could make out. Then he walked away, barefoot through snow that should have burned, and disappeared behind the chapel. They searched for him. They found only the blanket. It was warm. In the following days, people stopped walking alone. Even short distances, from barn to door, from well to home, were now traveled in pairs. No one said it aloud, but they all felt it. Something had shifted. Not just in weather or hunger or silence, but in the very shape of the days. Like the pattern had changed, and the rhythm of the world now moved to a new pulse, slower, stranger, offbeat. One night, the stars returned. It had been weeks since anyone had seen the sky, only clouds and snow and that endless, suffocating gray. But that night, for a few short hours, the clouds parted and the stars shone clear and sharp above the village. People stepped outside to look, not with joy exactly, but with something more ancient. Reverence, perhaps, or fear, because the stars were wrong. Not all of them, but enough. They were in places they shouldn't be, scattered slightly askew, as though the sky had shifted during the storm, and no one had noticed. The old woman saw this, too. She had not left her bed in 5 days. Yet that night, she stood beneath the eaves, barefoot, wrapped in nothing but wool and breath, and she looked up. She said nothing, but her lips moved. She was not praying. And the frost beneath her feet did not crack after the stars returned. Just once, just long enough to be seen, just briefly enough to be doubted. The sky closed again, like a mouth that had opened only to whisper something half-remembered and unfinished. And then came the darkest stretch yet. Days no longer offered relief. The sun, when it rose, did so as a smudge of pale, diluted gold behind layers of ash-colored cloud, too weak to cast shadows, too distant to warm even a breath. The air itself grew denser, heavier. It moved through the village with the weight of something old and watching, like the breath of a god too tired to speak but not yet willing to turn away. Inside the homes, firewood was now rationed as though it were blood. There were arguments, yes, though few and quiet. Even anger had softened in the cold. Voices did not rise. They frayed at the edges, like cloth worn too thin to hold shape. People snapped not with rage, but with weariness, and afterward would sit beside one another in silence, as if whatever had passed between them had melted before it even touched the surface. Some had begun burning things that were never meant for fire. Broken stools, broom handles, a wooden cradle that had once belonged to a child who no longer stirred when the wind howled. A painting, crude, of a lamb and a cross, taken from the chapel wall and fed to the flames by the widow whose husband had not returned from the upper hills. No one stopped her. No one spoke of it. And still the cold deepened. One man, whose name mattered once but not now, had taken to scratching symbols into the wall beside his bed. Not letters, not anything from the old books. Shapes, circles, lines that curved like vines and eyes. He didn't speak much anymore, but every morning there would be a new mark, carved with something sharp, something thin. And though no one saw it happen, they noticed the tips of his fingers were always red. Not from cold, but from effort. A steady, private devotion. A language he claimed had come to him in sleep. His wife no longer slept beside him. She had moved to the far end of the room, near the chimney, and had placed a bundle of garlic and dried sage between them. Not for scent, not for food, but for something older. The kind of protection passed down not in words but in gestures. From grandmothers who never smiled and mothers who lit candles in doorways without explaining why. The air inside the cottage had begun to change. It wasn't just the cold now. It was the feeling that the walls were no longer still, that the boards, swollen with damp, were shifting, not from wind, but breath. The windows fogged not from within but from without. And late at night, if you listened, truly listened, you might hear a slow creaking along the floorboards like the weight of someone pacing, or waiting. No one said these things aloud, but they tightened their cloaks before bed, and tucked their feet under the straw, and whispered to the fire as if it could hear them. In the chapel, the priest had stopped sweeping the moss. He told no one why. Perhaps he no longer believed in his reasons. Perhaps he had come to see it as something that would simply grow, regardless of hands or prayers. It no longer curled green and soft. Now it had deepened, a dark velvet black, like the fur of an animal that only appears in dreams. It spread across the stone in slow arcs, tracing paths that looked like roots but felt like runes. The priest watched it grow. He ate less, slept less, spoke only when spoken to. When he looked at the crucifix above the altar, his gaze often drifted, not to the face of Christ, but to the shadows beneath his feet. That was where the warmth seemed to gather now. At the edge of the village, the trees were different, not obviously, not in shape or number, but in presence. They stood closer to one another now, or so it seemed, their branches twisted into each other like fingers woven in prayer or warning. The snow beneath them never held tracks, not of deer, not of bird, not even of fox. It lay perfectly undisturbed, as if no living thing dared press weight against that whiteness. And yet the girl, the one who had begun to hum in the cold, claimed she'd seen lights between the trunks. Small ones, pale blue, moving slowly, not like fireflies, not like torches, like eyes, blinking in a rhythm too slow to be human. Her mother told her to hush, but her father, who rarely spoke now unless necessary, asked one question. Were they looking at you or past you? The girl said she didn't know, and in the way she said it, there was something quiet and true, something that made her father look away. That night, someone knocked on the door of the blacksmith's empty house. Just once. A single, slow knock. But the house had been sealed since the man's disappearance. The hearth was long cold. The windows dusted over. No candle burned within. Still, the knock came. The neighbor who lived beside him, a weaver with stiff hands and a bad knee, heard it clearly. He rose from bed, opened his own door, stepped out into the snow. There were no footprints, no visitor, just the sound of the door next to his slowly swinging inward, though no hand had touched the latch. The weaver said nothing the next day, but he did not sleep again. And now, beneath every roof, there began to grow the same sense, impossible to trace, impossible to explain, that something else had taken shelter for the winter. Not in one home, not in any particular barn or loft or storehouse, but everywhere, spread thin like fog, felt in corners, glimpsed in reflections, sensed just behind the shoulder in those fragile hours between midnight and the first lightless breath of dawn. Something ancient, something that did not fear the cold, because it had lived inside it since long before names were carved into stone. It did not knock twice. It did not speak. It did not move. It only waited. The days no longer felt separate from the nights. Time itself had begun to congeal, thick as pitch, flowing too slowly to measure, too silently to trust. You could wake in darkness and fall asleep again without ever seeing the color of the sky. Candles flickered not just to push the night away, but to remind the living that light, however thin, still had meaning, still meant something more than memory. But firewood was gone in more homes than not. In some cottages, families sat in their heavy cloaks even by day, wrapped in layers of old linens, sheepskins, any cloth that had not yet been turned into fuel. They held one another not from affection, but necessity. limbs tangled like roots beneath the earth, conserving warmth not out of love, but survival. And in that silence, a different intimacy grew, the kind that comes from knowing each other's breath, each other's fear, each other's refusal to speak of what the dark might be hiding. Some tried to pass the hours with old songs. One woman, quiet, bone-thin, with a voice like snow falling into soot, sang lullabies she claimed had come from her grandmother's grandmother. The words were strange, laced with consonants that scratched the ear and vowels that hung long after the tune was done. No one knew what they meant. Perhaps she didn't either. But when she sang them, something in the room would change. The hearth would pop, though there was no wood. A window might fog, though no one had breathed nearby. Once, a child woke screaming the moment the last note vanished. The woman never sang twice in one night, and yet people listened, because sometimes silence grew too large, and voices, even those born from dust and ghosts, were easier to carry than the weight of thought. One afternoon, though afternoon meant little now, a boy found a dead crow frozen mid-flight. Its wings stretched wide in the snow, as if it had simply stopped moving while airborne, then dropped without a sound. No wound, no blood, just rigid, glass-eyed stillness. His father made him bury it. But that evening, another appeared, not dead, but unmoving, perched on the church's cold iron bell. It stayed there for 3 days, never eating, never flying, always facing north. On the 4th day, it was gone. No feathers left behind, no trace. The priest would not look at the bell after that. He rang it once that week and never again. The snow deepened, swallowing fences, then hedgerows, then the short stone walls that marked the edge of the graveyard. Eventually, even the chapel steps vanished, and one had to dig a path just to open the door. Those who could still move between homes began to speak in murmurs about the old tales, the ones usually saved for drunk tongues and long summer twilights. They called it the deeping, not winter, not simply weather, but a season that forgot how to end. Came, they said, when people no longer feared the dark properly, when fire was treated as decoration, not offering, when the earth was dug too greedily, or prayers spoken too loudly, or silence left unanswered for too long. The deeping didn't freeze you from the outside. It crept inward, numbing memory, bending time, making day feel like dream and night like a mouth with too many teeth. No one ever knew when it started, or when it left, only that those who counted the days never lived to count the last. Of course, not everyone believed. One man, a merchant once, before the roads vanished, laughed at the stories. He mocked the songs, the garlic bundles, the chalk circles some had begun drawing beneath their beds. He said this was weather, nothing more. He burned a holy book in his hearth to prove it. That night, his dog chewed through the leather strap that kept the back gate shut. And when morning came, the gate stood open, but neither the dog nor the man were seen again. The snow near the threshold was untouched, flat, perfect, a surface that revealed nothing. Not struggle, not passage, as if the world had simply chosen to unwrite him. People stopped laughing after that. In one home, a child began waking at the same time each night, always the same hour, eyes wide, silent, staring at the ceiling. He would not speak, only point upward. When his mother asked what he saw, he shook his head. Not no, but something else, a refusal, a denial that speaking could help. On the 5th night, he whispered something just once before falling back asleep. They're listening. She did not ask who. In the barn behind that house, the ox had begun to face the far wall. Always the same direction, head lowered. Still, it would not turn even when fed, even when touched. Its breath fogged the air, but it did not respond to voice or smell or sound. Only stared at a plank of rotted wood, as though something waited behind it. No one moved the animal, but they no longer milked the cow nearby. Even the milk had begun to taste different, sharper, not spoiled exactly, just changed, as if it carried something it had not before, something that did not belong to the cow or the hay or the hands that carried the pail. Few drank it now. They left it out, hoping the cold would take it back. But by morning, The pail was always empty, and no frost on its rim. They tried to stay warm however they could. Some began boiling leather, old boots, strips of belt, anything to soften and chew. The broth was bitter, but it filled the stomach long enough to sleep, or dream, or pretend. Others dug through old trunks for forgotten herbs. The dried kind, wrapped in parchment and tied with brittle string, meant for healing wounds or drawing fevers. A woman brewed them in a blackened pot, sipping slowly, her eyes half closed. She claimed the tea let her speak with those who had not made it to this winter. She smiled when she said it, but her lips were cracked, and her teeth had gone dark. On the 6th night of the deep freeze, all the dogs in the village began to howl at once, not in chorus, not as if answering one another, but each in its own rhythm, a scatter of mournful voices, long, uneven, overlapping, rising into the sky as if calling something down, and just as suddenly they stopped, as though cued by a signal only they could hear. One man tried to follow the sound to its source. He walked deep into the snow, following the paths between homes, down the narrow lane where the birch trees leaned like listening men. His lantern burned low, but steady. He was never seen again, but the next day his lantern was found at the edge of the well, still burning, still warm. No one drew water from that well again. Some mornings, if you could still call them that, a pale orange light would appear in the east, thin and shy, as though the sun itself no longer trusted what the earth had become. It would linger behind the clouds like an intruder, barely touching the rooftops, never warming them, casting a weak glow over snow so deep and even it looked like cloth stretched tightly across the land. There were no shadows, only the suggestion of depth, the kind that made you wonder whether the white was just a surface or a veil concealing something more. In this quiet, time continued to dissolve. No bells marked the hours, no footsteps passed the windows, no merchants shouted in the lane. The world had shrunk inward, wrapped itself in silence and frost, until it became little more than a single room, a single fire, if you were lucky, and a breath that could be seen before it could be felt. Inside the houses, people began to watch each other differently. Not with suspicion, not exactly, but with a kind of reluctant curiosity. As if they were all slowly becoming something else, and no one was certain who would cross the line first, who would be the one to break or vanish or change into something unspoken. They rarely spoke of the dead, not the ones buried hastily beneath the snow, or the ones laid out on tables with coins pressed into cold eyelids. Certainly not the ones who had simply gone missing, taken a lantern and not returned, wandered into the woods despite warnings, followed an echo they could not name. Those were not called the dead. They were simply gone, because death at least had rules. The gone did not, and the children knew. They never asked why the frost crept in beneath the doors no matter how many furs were piled against the threshold. They never asked why the chimney smoked even when there was no fire beneath it, or why the frost on the window sometimes curled inward. Not in patterns like flowers or feathers, but like fingers. They simply watched, and sometimes whispered. One girl, hair brittle from cold, lips pale as candle wax, had begun drawing with charcoal on the walls. Small, delicate shapes, not flowers, not stars, but loops and spirals and jagged marks that seemed to form something only she could see. She never looked anyone in the eye while drawing, never answered when spoken to. Her father scrubbed the walls each night, but by morning the marks would return, in different places, different angles, as if they had never been erased, only moved. One evening, he found a drawing in the fireplace, drawn onto the blackened stone. It hadn't been there the night before. It was not a mark, but a face. Long, narrow, eyeless. He never touched the drawings again. Further north, in a farmhouse where the wind had shattered all but one window, a woman who once served as midwife sat alone with a bundle of cloth she would not let go. She had not spoken in 2 weeks. She hummed, sometimes, but her lips barely moved. The cloth she held never shifted, never cried. She insisted the child had survived the birthing, but there was no breath, and no warmth. The priest came once to speak with her. He did not stay long. Afterward, he sat by the chapel door for hours, hood drawn low, muttering prayers no one recognized. They were not Latin. They were not English. They were not for anyone living. And in the cemetery behind the chapel, the one whose stones now barely broke through the snow, someone had begun lighting candles. No one admitted to it. The flames burned low, their wax dripping directly into the ice, but each night they would return, glowing like small eyes along the edge of the graveyard, never more than 6, never less than 5. Always in a crooked line, no tracks led to them, and no tracks ever led away. Still, people tried to hold to what they knew. Routines were invented where none were needed. A man might brush snow from the same square of ground each day, even though it would be buried again within the hour. A woman might polish her only copper bowl until it gleamed dull red in the candlelight. Not to eat from, but to see herself in, to remember her face as it had once been. One boy spent every evening carving birds into a beam above his bed. Not delicate doves, but rough shapes, wings wide, beaks sharp. When asked why, he said only, "So they know where to fly when it's time." He never said who they were, or when that time would come. Some families huddled in basements, in the earth's belly, surrounded by stone walls that wept moisture and cold. There, beneath their homes, they lit stubs of candle and spoke in hushed tones. Not because of fear, but because of memory. There had once been warmth here, once had been feasts and music and noise, but now even the rats had gone quiet. Father told a story there once, of the first winter after the plague, of how people had burned entire fields to frighten the sickness away. He spoke of the smoke, thick and oily, and how it had crawled across the village like something with purpose. He said it worked for a while, but he didn't explain why his voice shook, or why, when he finished, he touched the floorboards above his head and whispered something under his breath. The others didn't ask. There were rules now, unspoken but known. Don't speak of the well. Don't look into the dark too long. Don't let the fire die while someone is sleeping. And never, under any circumstances, open the window after midnight, no matter what you hear, especially if it sounds like your name. Some claimed the cold wasn't natural, that it no longer obeyed weather or season or even time, crept in places it shouldn't, into the seams of the body, the edges of thought. One woman began to lose sensation in her fingers, though they were wrapped in for layers. Then her toes, then her lips. Her breath remained, but her skin did not remember heat. She said the cold was inside her now, not as pain but as memory, as if something had touched her, just once, and now carried her name in its own tongue. That night, she walked barefoot into the snow. They followed her footprints for nearly half a mile. Then the prints stopped, not trailed off, not covered, stopped, as though she had simply vanished upward. When they returned to her cottage, the fire had gone out. Not slowly, not as ember to ash, but all at once, as if it had never burned at all. The hearth was cold, but the air inside the house was warm. Too warm. They did not enter. The door was nailed shut, and no one spoke her name again. In winters such as these, people began to forget that spring had ever been real. It wasn't that they stopped believing it would return. They still marked the days with notches and beams, still nodded toward the far end of March like it was a promise whispered by saints, but belief turned brittle under the weight of long silence. It became something more like a lullaby, sung not to be believed but to keep the dark from listening too closely, because something was listening. It wasn't hunger, though hunger had ears of its own, and it could hum like a wasp's nest in the hollow of your stomach. And it wasn't fear, at least not the ordinary kind. It was something that stirred when the house was too still, when the last candle burned too cleanly, when the snow outside looked too perfect, like a smooth cloth drawn over a body no one dared to touch. It wasn't even the cold itself. It was what the cold allowed in. You could tell the difference by the way the animals behaved. The pigs, for instance, had grown oddly quiet, even when fed. Their eyes lingered too long on the door after it closed, as if waiting for something else to follow behind. A black rooster had taken to circling the well 3 times each dawn, scratching at the frozen rim with a deliberate, mechanical rhythm, then vanishing behind the stables without leaving tracks. A cat was found sleeping directly atop the altar in the chapel, eyes open, unmoving, like a statue. When Father Edric tried to remove it, his hands blistered without touching the fur. No one spoke of that again. Elsewhere, people clung to habits, rituals that once might have seemed strange, even absurd. A widow placed garlic in her shoes each morning, not for spirits, she said, but because she dreamed of her late husband standing barefoot in the snow. She claimed his eyes were blue, though in life they had been brown, and that his mouth was full of salt. An old man kept a circle of ash around his bed, redrawn each dusk with the end of his walking stick. When asked, he said only, "She doesn't like ash," and refused to speak further. No one ever saw who she was. Children, when allowed to play, no longer laughed. They whispered. Games turned strange. One required two to hide beneath the floorboards while a third recited names from the parish register backward. Another involved making dolls from straw and hair, not their own, and lining them along the windowsill, always facing inward. If one turned during the night, the children would not enter the room for days. And yet, despite all this, life continued. Meals were made when food allowed. Bread, coarse and hard-edged, more husk than flour. Root vegetables dug from the frostbitten ground, scraped clean with flint or bone. Broths brewed from marrow and onion skin, simmered in blackened pots until the steam coated the ceiling beams in dew. The air smelled of wet iron and boiled stone, of wool and wood smoke and something sour beneath it all, like old grief. People sat in silence to eat, chewing slowly, not from reverence but necessity. The meals had become rites, anchoring them to something older than hunger. Sometimes, just before sleep, you could hear the sound of chairs being pulled away from walls. Not yours, not your neighbor's, just somewhere. And if you listened too long, the sound would stop, as though it had never begun. There was a village just 2 hills to the west, now abandoned. Not destroyed, not raided or burned, simply empty. Doors hung open but unbroken. Fires had burned out, but without chaos. Bread still lay half-sliced on tables. A child's toy rested neatly atop a blanket. All untouched, as if everyone had left at once. Not running, not in fear, but in answer to something that did not require speech. Some said the wind from that direction smelled too clean. Others said it didn't move at all. A tanner who went to retrieve a saddle left behind returned before nightfall, white as the snow he walked through. He said only, "They're still there," and refused to speak again, not even to his wife, not even when she died. After that, he spent most of his time beneath his workbench, murmuring to the leather. In the monastery outside the forest, the monks no longer sang. The bells still rang, but not on the hour. Once, they rang 7 times at midnight. Another time, 9 rings at dawn, though no sun followed. When questioned, the abbot said the bells answered someone else now. No one asked whom. The stone walls of the cloister had begun to sweat, despite the cold. Moisture dripped slowly between the cracks in the masonry, forming dark trails across the iconography. One of the novices tried to clean them. His hands blistered, and still somehow winter held, not as season but as sentence. Time twisted in the corners of rooms. Candles burned slower, then faster. Bread went stale in minutes or lasted for weeks untouched. A woman claimed to have woken with snow in her hair, though every window was shut and the roof sealed tight with pitch. A boy swore he saw a white figure move across the fields, soundless and barefoot, pausing only to watch the chimney smoke before vanishing into the trees. No one argued. They had all begun to see things. Not always the same things, but echoes of each other's fears, as if the very air had begun to remember what lived inside them. Regrets, losses, names never spoken aloud, and reflect them back with a calm, terrible clarity. And in that clarity came waiting, not hope, not anticipation, something slower, something patient, something that had always been there, in the corners of eyes and the gaps in the rafters, watching the world forget how to be warm. The snow piled higher, an endless white that swallowed the land and silenced footsteps, muffled voices, and blurred the shapes of trees until even their shadows seemed unsure where to fall. The village was wrapped in a heavy stillness, like a breath held too long, waiting, perhaps, for a moment that had slipped beyond reach. Inside the houses, light grew dimmer with every passing day. Candles, once plentiful, were now scarce as wishes. The hearths, too, grew smaller in their flames, the dancing tongues reduced to mere flickers, fighting desperately against the encroaching dark. The smell of smoke mixed with the sharp tang of cold metal and old wood soaked in moisture, while beneath it all lingered the faint, unsettling odor of something forg. People rarely spoke anymore, their voices retreating into a quiet murmur or the long silences that filled rooms like fog. When they did, their words were slow and deliberate, chosen with care, as though to weigh the sound before releasing it into the air. The children, once restless and full of laughter, moved now with a strange grace, like shadows learning to walk. Their eyes were wide and glassy, reflecting the dim candlelight as if holding secrets meant only for the dark. They whispered to one another in a language older than words, voices barely above a breath, sharing story. Outside, the wind moaned through the empty fields, bending the snow into strange shapes, twisted spirals and sharp peaks that glistened under the rare, pale light. Sometimes it carried faint sounds, a distant bell tolling, footsteps crunching in the ice, a soft crying that could have been the wind or so. The village animals grew quieter, too. The dogs no longer barked. Their eyes followed unseen paths beyond the frozen gates. Cats slinked through shadows, their fur bristling with a tension no one understood. Even the birds, once noisy heralds of the changing seasons, had vanished without trace. In one small cottage near the edge of the village, a woman sat by a dying fire, her hands wrapped around a cracked wooden cup. She gazed into its depths, watching the last drops of cold broth swirl like dark oil. Her breath came slow and shallow, mingling with the smoke curling toward the low ceiling. Around her, the walls were lined with faded tapestries, their once bright colors muted beneath layers of soot and frost. She began to hum softly, a melody twisted with longing and fear, each note falling like a delicate snowflake onto the quiet. The song told of winters long past, of fires kept alive by whispered prayers, of nights when the stars themselves seemed to flicker in sympathy. It spoke of waiting for dawn, for warmth, for something that might never come. Outside her window, the snow continued to fall. It drifted lazily, thick and silent, blanketing the world in a softness that was both gentle and endless. And beneath that endless white, something stirred. A slow pulse beneath the frozen earth, a breath beneath the silent fields. The woman's song faltered. She looked up, eyes meeting the shadows that gathered in the corners of the room. For a moment, the world held its breath. And then, from the silence, came a whisper. The whisper lingered longer than it should have, brushing the air like the faintest touch of a hand not quite there. A breath that slipped between walls and settled beneath skin. It was a sound without source, a voice without shape, as if the house itself had learned to speak in tones too quiet to hear with ears alone. The woman froze, her fingers tightening around the wooden cup until the worn edges bit into her palms. Her gaze drifted toward the hearth, where the last embers smoldered, casting a weak, trembling glow that barely reached the shadows gathering beyond the far corner. The tapestries on the walls fluttered ever so slightly, though no draft stirred the still air. Outside, the world remained shrouded in snow and silence, but inside, the very walls seemed to lean closer, as if listening, as if waiting for something to unfold in the hush. She rose slowly, her footsteps muffled by thick woolen rugs worn threadbare from years of use. The flickering candlelight traced the lines of her face, etched with fatigue and the slow, creeping weight of unspoken fear. She moved toward the window, drawing aside the heavy linen curtain, revealing a world softened by snow and obscured by the low, gray sky. Far off, beyond the fields and frozen trees, shadows shifted, indistinct but unmistakable. Movement where none should be, a gathering presence at the edge of the village, where the woods thickened and the cold held fast like a curse. The woman's breath fogged the glass as she pressed her palm against the chill, a silent question hanging between her and the dusk. Behind her, the fire guttered, its light fighting a losing battle against the night that crept steadily inward. The faint scent of smoke mixed with damp earth and something else, something ancient and forgotten, a smell like the memory of stone and moss and the last exhale of a long-closed grave. She turned back, the shadows in the room deepening, the whisper returning. Closer now, almost a song, yet too fragile to hold. The village slept, though sleep here was not rest but a fragile suspension, a holding pattern between fear and hope, between what was and what might never be again. And somewhere beyond the snowdrifts and silent trees, the unseen waited patiently, watching, listening, breathing with the cold itself. Night deepened, folding the village into its endless cloak of frost and shadow. Within the thick stone walls of the cottages, flickering flames strained against the dark, their warmth fragile and fleeting. The air was thick with the scent of cold earth and smoldering wood, mingled with something else, a quiet weight that settled like dust, unseen but ever-present. The woman sat again by the dying fire, her hands wrapped around the cracked cup, fingers tracing the worn patterns in the wood, as if seeking solace in their familiar grooves. Her eyes, heavy with sleepless nights and whispered fears, gazed into the flickering shadows that danced across the walls. In that wavering light, the shapes seemed to pulse with a life of their own, twisting, shifting, as if the very room breathed alongside her. Outside, the wind moaned low and mournful, threading its way through the hollow spaces between houses, carrying with it the faintest hint of a melody. A song half-remembered, a lullaby lost to time. It was a sound both comforting and unsettling, like a voice reaching across centuries, calling softly to those who dared to listen. Within the village, the people had begun to adopt their own silent vigils. Groups huddled together in dim rooms, wrapped in layers of wool and fur, their eyes heavy but alert, listening for sounds that might herald change or danger. No one spoke loudly. Conversations were muted, words spoken in hushed tones, as if louder voices might stir the shadows that lurked just beyond the hearth's glow. Children, their cheeks flushed from cold, sat close to their elders, absorbing stories told not as tales but as warnings. Fragments of memories woven with careful omission, threads of history left deliberately loose. They learned to recognize the patterns in the silence, the rhythms in the darkness, the spaces where the unseen slipped quietly through. The church bell tolled irregularly now, its deep, resonant peals echoing across the frozen fields, marking moments that seemed both too long and too fleeting to grasp. The priest's face was drawn and pale, eyes shadowed by exhaustion and secrets he would not share. He moved through the village like a ghost, offering blessings in whispered prayers, his hands trembling as he crossed himself. Beneath the snow, the earth held its own secrets, frozen and silent, yet teeming with the slow pulse of life that persisted despite the cold. Roots twisted beneath the frost, reaching for warmth that was no longer there, while ancient stones lay buried, their inscriptions worn by time and covered in moss and ice. In the quiet moments before dawn, when the village held its breath, the faintest stirrings could be heard, the creak of timber settling, the distant howl of a lone wolf, the soft rustle of fabric as someone shifted beneath heavy blankets. It was in these moments that the boundary between the known and the unknown seemed thinnest, when the night's silence whispered its most urgent secrets. And so the vigil continued, a delicate balance between hope and fear, light and shadow, warmth and cold. Each day folded into the next, a seamless thread woven through with uncertainty and the quiet promise of change. The days no longer passed so much as sank, one into another, like footprints slowly erased beneath falling snow. Time lost its sharp edges in the cold. There were no clocks, no ticking hours to divide the morning from the dusk. Only the fading light and the deepening chill told of evening's approach, and even that grew uncertain, as the sun lingered low behind pale clouds and shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. In the forest beyond the village, nothing stirred. The trees stood locked in stillness, their branches heavy with snow, their trunks creaking faintly when the wind moved low and slow through their frozen ribs. Birds had long fallen silent. Even the crows, those ever-watchful heralds of endings, had vanished weeks before, leaving behind only the occasional black feather caught in the ice like a warning half-buried. The woman, now thinner, quieter, walked slower through her days. She no longer went to the well without reason. The cold was too cruel, too deeply woven into the stone of the path, the air like glass against her skin. When she did step outside, her breath formed clouds that hovered in front of her face like ghosts that would not rise. Her boots, patched with old leather and cloth, left shallow prints that filled in almost instantly with drifting snow. There were fewer visitors now, fewer voices at the door. Even the priest had stopped his rounds. Illness had taken root again, not with fever, but with weariness. A deep fatigue that pulled at the limbs, clouded the eyes, slowed the heartbeat. They called it the winter weight, but no one grew heavier. Quite the opposite. Inside, the rooms stayed dim. Windows were covered with cloth, not just to keep out the cold, but to keep something else from looking in. Candles burned low, fat and wax rationed carefully, and their light threw strange shadows that clung to walls like cobwebs. People had started whispering again. Not stories, but fragments. Little things. Things they thought they saw in the corners of their eyes. Things they heard scratching, faint tapping, breathing too deep to be theirs. The woman kept the hearth burning as best she could. The wood pile had dwindled faster than expected. Her fingers, numb and red, worked slowly when splitting kindling, and each strike of the axe echoed like a shout in the silence. Every log added to the fire felt like a tiny prayer, not to the saints, not even to the old gods, but to the cold itself. A bargain. Take this warmth and let me stay one more night. Sometimes, in the silence between the crackle of flames and the sigh of the wind, she heard footsteps. Just once or twice. Not heavy, not hurried, just a slow, steady pace. Outside her window, across the snow-packed earth. She never went to look, not because she feared what she might see, but because she feared she might see nothing at all. There was something about the winter that frayed the border between what was real and what was remembered. Faces of the long dead returned in dreams, and sometimes, just sometimes, in the reflections of dark glass or the shimmer of melting ice. People spoke to the air as if someone stood there. Perhaps someone did. Beneath the frost, beneath the soil hardened by 1,000 frozen dawns, the land remembered everything. Every death, every oath, every secret left unspoken, and every sin buried in silence. Winter pressed its hand gently over it all, muffling screams and songs alike. And still, the nights grew colder. The silence was no longer just an absence of noise. It had grown dense, textured, almost physical, like the thick woolen cloths hung across doorways to hold back drafts, or the packed snow that sealed the thatch roofs, muffling what little life still stirred beneath. It wasn't empty. It was full. Full of things unspoken. Full of breath held just a little too long. Full of waiting. People had begun to hear things. Not clearly. Not always. But often enough that they no longer dismissed them as tricks of the wind. A sigh that didn't come from anyone in the room. A creak on the floor when no one moved. A rhythm barely audible, like fingers tapping lightly on wood, always just beyond the source of light. The kind of sound you felt rather than heard, like a presence pacing quietly inside the walls of your own body. In the long hours between dusk and dawn, when dreams began to twist in the minds of the half-sleeping, the villagers no longer trusted what their eyes showed them. Candle flames tilted when there was no breeze. Shadows shifted on their own. Faces in firelight changed subtly, a familiar jawline becoming thinner, a neighbor's eye seeming to look through you rather than at you. No one spoke of it openly, but more and more, people stopped meeting each other's gaze. The woman had taken to sleeping in the chair beside the hearth, wrapped in all the blankets she owned, her feet pressed close to the last embers. She rarely closed her eyes for long, not out of fear exactly, but out of something older than fear, a kind of instinct like an animal that knows not to sleep too deeply when the scent of something unnatural drifts in with the cold. Each night she listened, not just with her ears, but with her bones, with the hollow of her chest, with the back of her neck where the skin felt too thin against the dark. The house creaked as all old houses do, but sometimes there was a pattern, a rhythm, a presence that seemed to wait for her to breathe before answering with one of its own. One night, or what passed for night, for time had nearly dissolved. She heard the bell again, faint, distant, not from the church tower but further beyond. From the woods, one toll, then nothing, no echo, as if the snow had swallowed the sound whole. She sat still, her hand tightening around the wool at her chest. She said nothing. She did not move. The fire dimmed further, its orange heart flickering low, and outside, the wind ceased altogether. No one spoke of the bell the next day, but 2 doors remained closed that morning, and when the baker went to knock, no one answered. The footprints in the snow had already been filled in by new flakes, soft and gentle, as if covering something not meant to be seen. The silence that followed was not of grief, nor of denial. It was of acceptance, a kind of quiet long practiced, like a hymn recited too many times to still feel its meaning. Life in winter demanded this. Not hope, not understanding, just endurance. And through it all, the cold continued. It pressed its fingers through walls, crept up through floorboards, rested like invisible dust upon every surface. Even the flame had changed, no longer golden, but pale, flickering with a strange bluish edge at its core, as though it too had begun to forget the warmth it once knew. When the woman finally lay down again, it was not for sleep. It was for stillness. She did not dream, but she listened, and in the thick dark, something listened back. The fire went out sometime during the night, though she could not say when. It hadn't sputtered or snapped. It simply faded, as if deciding on its own that warmth was no longer needed, or no longer welcome. When the woman woke, or perhaps merely shifted from one kind of awareness into another, the room had grown darker than it should have been. Even the air felt different, not colder, exactly, but thicker, as if it carried something more than breath, something ancient, something waiting. She did not stir at once. Her fingers remained curled under the coarse blanket, her body heavy, her limbs slow to respond. Her eyes were open, but she kept them fixed on the hearth, where only a pale ring of ash remained, as delicate as snow, though heavier in meaning. Beneath that ash, perhaps a single coal still glowed, but even that was uncertain. She did not go to check. There are moments in winter, rare, soft, and terrible, when the world forgets to move, when not a single tree groans, when not a single flake falls, when even the wind seems to draw breath and hold it. This was one of those moments, and in its quiet, the silence ceased to be comforting. From somewhere far off, a distance both immeasurable and intimate, came a sound. Not loud, not sharp, a low dragging, like cloth pulled across old stone. It lasted only a few heartbeats and then was gone. She might have imagined it. She almost wanted to believe she had, but her hands had begun to tremble, and deep within her spine, there bloomed that ancient human knowledge that something unseen had crossed a threshold. The dog that had once slept by the hearth, old, gray, and slow-moving, was no longer there. He had vanished 2 nights earlier, slipping out through the crack in the door before she could stop him. She hadn't called after him. She hadn't dared. Some part of her, deeply buried and long silent, understood that he was not running from something, but going toward it. As animals sometimes do when they sense the thinning of the veil between this world and what lies beneath it. No one had seen him since. That morning she did not dress. She kept to the chair, her shawl drawn tight, her breath slow and shallow. Food no longer tasted of anything. Even the bread, dense and coarse, left her mouth dry. The stew, thin as broth, offered only the memory of warmth. Hunger had dulled into habit, and thirst became something symbolic, a gesture toward living, rather than life itself. When she rose at last, it was not to rebuild the fire. Instead, she went to the window. The cloth that had covered it for weeks had grown stiff with frost, and she peeled it back slowly, fingers numb. The outside world was untouched, eerily pristine. No tracks, no wind. The trees stood motionless, their branches heavy, curved downward like arms in mourning. Across the field, a single black shape stood still. Not a man, not a beast, something undefined by distance. She blinked, and it was gone. She did not speak of it. Later, the church bell rang again, just once, and then once more, but not a second ring. A second voice, slightly delayed. Two tones, as if echoed, but not echoed by stone. Echoed by something colder, something deeper. The others heard it too. Faces turned toward the sound, and eyes met for the first time in days. But no words passed between them. There are things which, when spoken aloud, lose their shape and become something worse. So they remained within the walls of their houses, sitting beside unlit hearths, each one listening for that third chime that never came. Night returned like a blanket soaked in ink, folding over rooftops, pressing against windows. Inside, the darkness grew bold. Corners stretched. Ceilings receded. The very air seemed to lean in, to draw closer, as though trying to remember the shape of the bodies it surrounded. And when she closed her eyes, she heard it again. Not outside, not beyond the walls, but just behind her ear. So soft, so careful, as if a mouth had opened in the space between seconds. A breath not her own. There is a cold that lives beneath the skin. Not the cold of the wind, or of ice pressed against flesh, but something quieter, a hollowing. It does not arrive all at once, but seeps in gradually, until even the memory of warmth feels distant and artificial, like something told to you in a story you once believed. She no longer counted the days. The markings she had scratched into the wooden beam beside her bed, small, shallow lines, each representing a sunrise endured, had faded. The wood had darkened with age and smoke, and the carvings vanished into its grain like thoughts swallowed by forgetting. Whether it was the 32nd day of the freeze or the 55th, no one knew. No one asked. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. But that did not bring relief. It was the stillness after the storm. Not peace, but pause. A waiting. The kind of silence that made you feel you had stepped outside the world and into a place that did not quite recognize you. Paths that had once been beaten flat by boots and sleighs were now gone, covered over with a crust of frost that shimmered like glass and creaked beneath every hesitant step. Trees bowed lower, roofs sighed under weight, doors stuck, and the wind had changed. It no longer howled as it once did, no longer swept in great roars across the land. Instead, it whispered. It slipped through the smallest cracks in walls and chimneys, and when it came, it sounded not like air but like breathing. In and out, a rhythm too steady to be chance. She had begun to dream more vividly and more often. Not of her past, but of places she had never seen. A tower, crumbling and twisted, with a staircase that led down instead of up. A frozen river where black fish swam beneath the ice in perfect circles. A forest made of bones, not branches, where the snow never melted, and the air tasted faintly of iron and smoke. These visions came not just at night, but when she blinked too long or sat too still. And though she did not speak of them, she felt they were not hers alone. Others in the village had changed too. Children no longer played in the snow. Their laughter, once the last bright sound before dusk, had vanished. They watched instead, from behind shutters, from corners, from beneath heavy blankets. Their eyes too wide, too quiet. Men no longer gathered near the well. The blacksmith's hammer had not rung in days. The sound of metal on metal, once a steady heartbeat in the cold, had stopped without warning. Some said he had taken ill. Others whispered that his forge fire had gone out and would not relight, no matter how he fed it. And the bell no longer rang. On the 15th night since its last toll, she opened the church door herself. It had not been her intention. She had only gone for wood, hoping to find a branch that had not yet turned to stone with frost. But something in the way the path curved, in the way the wind moved her feet, brought her to the threshold instead. The door stood ajar, frost feathering its edges like a warning left by unseen hands. Inside, the air was impossibly still. The stained glass windows were rimmed with ice, and the light that filtered through them took on strange hues: pale green, bruised violet, a sickly gold. The pews were empty, yet dustless, as if recently abandoned. At the altar, the candles had burned to stubs. Their wax melted down the sides like frozen tears. And behind the pulpit, where the great iron bell rope should have hung, there was only a frayed thread, dangling, severed. She did not speak. She did not breathe. Somewhere deeper in the building, something shifted. A footstep, a weight settling, a sigh too long to belong to the living. She left before she could learn which. Back in her home, she lit the lamp with trembling fingers. The oil burned fast, as if eager to be used. She sat by the fireless hearth and listened to the silence pressing in on all sides. Her hands, once chapped and raw, no longer felt pain. They had grown pale and smooth, almost translucent, as if forgetting what it meant to be touched by warmth. She touched her face, felt unfamiliar, the bones sharper, the skin thinner. Her reflection in the kettle's blackened metal showed her only a suggestion of herself, hollow-eyed, expressionless, distant. That night she dreamed of doors, so many doors, each one slightly open, and behind every one, a sound. Not a voice, but something waiting to become one. When she awoke, her breath clouded the air like smoke, but there was no fire. The cold no longer felt like punishment. It had become something else entirely. Not merely the absence of heat, but a presence of its own, old and unmoving, like a gaze that one cannot see but always feels. It clung not just to stone and timber, but to memory itself, dulling it, smoothing over the edges of grief and hope alike, until time became a white blur. One long, unbroken season where nothing truly began or ended. By now, even the animals had changed. Ravens circled lower in the sky, their cries sharper, briefer, like warnings rather than songs. The dogs, once loyal and tireless, no longer barked at strangers or stirred from their places beneath beds and tables. Some had stopped eating. Some stared at the walls as if listening. Others had simply vanished. One morning, though morning had become more of an idea than an event, a boy appeared at the edge of the village. No one knew where he had come from. His cloak was thin, his boots too large, his eyes glassy and rimmed with frost, but he did not seem afraid. He walked slowly between the houses, silent and dry-eyed, as if searching for something he could not name. A few followed him at a distance, unsure whether to help or retreat. But the boy did not speak. He stopped in front of the blacksmith's closed door, touched it once with 2 fingers, then turned and left the way he had come, vanishing down a path no one remembered being there. They did not follow him. In that same week, the well froze entirely. Not the rim or the bucket or the topmost water, but the whole of it, solid, unmoving, as if the ground had decided to keep its secrets. No one dared chip at it. It felt wrong, somehow, as though something slept beneath, and the sound of cracking ice might wake it. Inside the homes, what would remain was guarded jealously. Small piles, once stacked near hearths in hopeful defiance, now hid under beds, wrapped in cloth as if the mere sight of them might hasten their disappearance. Some families had begun burning furniture. Others had resorted to sitting in silence, wrapped in furs, waiting for the sun that rarely came. The oil lamps gave off less light than before. The flames flickered sideways, as though leaning away from something unseen. But the strangest change was not in the homes, or the woods, or the sky. It was in the people. They no longer asked if spring would come. That question had faded, too sharp, too painful. They spoke instead in fragments, half-thoughts, echoes. "Do you remember when the snow used to melt?" Someone murmured once, and no one replied. They didn't remember, or they didn't want to. Murmured once, and no one replied. They didn't remember, or they didn't want to. Even the priest had gone quiet. He sat most days in the back of the church, wrapped in his robes, lips moving but no sound emerging. When she passed him once, on her way back from gathering roots, he looked up, and his eyes were different. Not empty, not afraid, just removed, as if he were seeing something that no longer shared this world. And then the dreams changed. Before, they had been strange but distant. Now they pressed closer. She dreamt not of places but of moments, almost memories that felt too vivid to be imagined, but too unfamiliar to be her own. She saw a child burying something in the snow with trembling hands, a figure standing motionless on a frozen lake, arms outstretched, as if welcoming something above. A door, the same door, always the same, locked from the inside, with scratches on its frame and ice growing upward from the floor. Each time she woke, it took longer to be sure she had. There was a night, or what she believed to be night, when she heard footsteps on her roof. Slow, deliberate, not the sound of ice cracking or snow sliding, but the weight of someone or something moving overhead. She did not go outside. She did not move at all. In the morning, she saw no tracks in the snow, only one black feather, long and curved, pressed into the frost on her windowsill. By now, her world had shrunk. The entire village was reduced to a few well-worn paths. House to well, house to chapel, house to field, and back again. Every other road had been buried or abandoned. And beyond the trees, those dark, leaning silhouettes that crowded closer each week, there was only white. A white so vast, so complete, it no longer seemed like snow, more like silence made visible. And yet, despite it all, they remained. Whether from habit or hope, stubbornness or surrender, they stayed. Because to leave meant walking into something even stranger. A world beyond the forest, beyond the frozen hills, where the snow might never end and the sky might never turn again. And still, something waited. She could feel it now more each day, not in the sky or beneath the ice, but inside. A pulse beneath the numbness, a stirring beneath the stillness. As if the season itself were watching, holding its breath, preparing to speak. But what it would say and whether they would survive hearing it, no one yet knew. There came a point in the long hush of that endless season when even the act of noticing became dangerous, when looking too closely at the frost patterns on the windows, or the shape of shadows along the walls, brought not answers but unease. Something about the way the ice spread in jagged spirals, or how the wind slipped between the beams, seemed to speak in a language no one remembered how to read. It was during these days, or hours, or whatever one should call the gray-lidded passage of time, that she began to hear the sound. It wasn't a voice, not truly, more like the low resonance of something shifting deep beneath the earth. A weight being moved, pressure changing. At first, she mistook it for the creak of the rafters or the rumble of her own breath against silence. But it came again and again, soft, irregular, and always from the same direction, beneath. The others noticed it too, though no one wanted to say so out loud. Eyes met briefly and slid away. Hands stilled mid-motion. Conversations died before reaching their middle. Even children, who once laughed in defiance of the cold, grew still and watched the floor as if listening. One man, the miller's eldest son, announced he would dig through the snow, through the ice and earth if he had to find the cause. He left with an axe, a rope, and a charm knotted from ash branches. He did not return. They waited a day, then another, and on the third morning, a strange thing happened. A line of frost, thicker and darker than any before, appeared across the threshold of the chapel, not blown by wind, not tracked by feet. It arced like a crescent, forming the shape of an open mouth. No one entered the chapel that day. By then, hunger was not a sensation so much as a rhythm. The stomach no longer ached. It simply grew quiet. People moved more slowly, not from choice but because it seemed to take longer to decide what to do next. Thoughts came heavy and late, like snow falling in layers over memory. She had begun rationing her thoughts the way she rationed salt or fire. 1 memory per day, she told herself. 1 full memory. Any more and she feared something inside might break. So she chose carefully. The sound of her mother humming while shelling peas. The warmth of bread wrapped in cloth. The color of the sky on the last day before the snow began. But even those memories had begun to shift, as if viewed through smoke or reflected in water that had frozen and cracked. Sometimes her mother's voice took on an accent she didn't remember. Sometimes the color of the sky was wrong. One night, as she lay wrapped in a patchwork of hides and old robes, her breath curling faintly toward the ceiling, she heard the sound again. But this time it was different. Closer. Came in pulses, like something breathing, not air, but weight. The breathing of a presence so old it no longer needed lungs. She could feel it in her spine, in the floorboards, in her teeth. And then came something even more unsettling. Silence. Not the ordinary hush that had become the village's constant companion, but a sudden, heavy absence. A silence so complete it felt like being locked out of her own thoughts. No wind, no cracking wood, no breath. She sat up slowly, pressing her palm to the wall. The world held still. And then a knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps on her door. She did not move, not right away, because she knew the knock had not come from outside. It had come from inside the wood, from within the grain of the door itself, as if something was not requesting to enter, but remembering how to leave. When morning came, if morning it was, the sky had darkened to the color of lead. Not storm dark, not snow dark, but something else. A color that did not belong in the air, a shade too deep to have risen from the sky itself. It seemed to seep from the land, from the trees, from the old stones. The villagers gathered less often now. Eyes turned inward. No one counted days. No one asked who had been seen and who hadn't. Names no longer passed lips. Not out of malice, but because the names themselves had begun to feel fragile, unsafe, like threads that might snap if pulled too hard. She walked to the edge of the village that day, where the path ended in a wall of drifted snow and skeletal trees. There were no tracks. There hadn't been any for weeks. Not even the birds dared land. And yet, beneath the hush, the sound remained. Waiting, patient, like the cold itself had grown tired of being silent and had begun to dream of speech. And still, no one knew what it wanted. It was not the snow that frightened them most in the end, nor the biting winds that flayed the skin like blades of salt, nor even the hunger, though that too had become an old god in the village, daily worshipped with empty bowls and lips pressed together to quiet the trembling. No, what they feared now, in the slow collapse of their understanding, was the idea that spring might never come again. Not late, not delayed, simply removed. They began to speak of the year without a spring in whispers, careful not to let their words reach the hearths or rafters, lest the house itself decide to believe them. It wasn't superstition, not exactly. It was more a recognition, born of weeks under a sky that no longer turned blue, that something had changed its mind about the cycle of time. The sun, when it appeared, came thin and white, like a memory of warmth rather than the thing itself. Cast no shadows. It gave no heat, just the shape of light, diluted, fading even as it arrived. Trees did not tremble with new buds. Animals did not stir beneath their burrows. The ground lay sealed. The earth's breath held so long it had forgotten how to release it. And beneath that silence, they still heard the sound. She had grown used to it by now, not as comfort, never that, but as a kind of anchor, a rhythm in the bones, a deep, subtle pressure behind the eyes. Not always present, not always absent. It came like the tide, though the village had never known the sea. There were moments she even thought she understood it, the way you understand a bird's direction or a stone's weight. Not through language, through presence. One night, during the longest stretch of dark yet, she found herself standing before the chapel again. The frost mouth on the threshold was still there, though it had changed, widened, deepened, as if the cold had licked away at the stone, or something beneath had begun to feed. She hadn't meant to walk there. Her legs had simply taken her, as if drawn by an old command. She stepped across the threshold. Inside, the chapel was quiet, not in the way of abandoned places, but in the way of spaces that were never truly meant for human voices. The altar had long since been cleared of its relics. The crucifix remained, though it too had changed. The wood blackened with age or smoke, the figure on it twisted slightly, as though it had tried to turn away. Candles stood unlit. Dust hung in the air like mist. And from deep beneath the floor, below the flagstones, below the foundation, below even the memory of the men who built it, came the sound. This time it was closer than ever before. Not a breath, not a whisper, a slow, patient turning, like a wheel under soil, like stone shifting against stone in some long-forgotten mechanism. It had a rhythm, but not one she recognized. Not heartbeat, nor clock, nor chime. It was older than all of those. Something the earth remembered before it bore trees. She stepped forward once, then again, each footfall echoing despite the damp, then stopped. There, in the center of the chapel, lay footprints. Not old, not melted, not hers. They circled once, then again the shape of a spiral, and disappeared beneath the altar, as though the person or the thing had walked downward into the floor itself. She did not run. She did not scream. She only stood, breathing slowly, one hand resting on the pillar, her palm pressed flat against the cold stone, and she realized the silence had returned. That deep, unnatural quiet. It was not empty. It was listening. The thaw, when it came, was not as they remembered. There was no birdsong, no sudden rush of meltwater cascading from rooftops, no joyful cries of children freed from snowbound doors, no scent of wet earth rising from the fields. Only a soft, almost imperceptible loosening of the air, as though the cold had taken its leave not with drama, but with weariness. Not defeated, merely done. The villagers emerged from their homes with care, not celebration. Faces pale, skin paper-thin, hands shaking from weeks of stillness. Their eyes adjusted not to brightness, the sky remained leaden, but to space, to openness, to the unfamiliar stretch of path between doorways no longer buried. They stepped lightly, almost reverently, as if the ground might collapse under the weight of their remembering. The woman stood at her doorway, cloak drawn close, and stared at the trees. No buds, no movement, just branches, brittle, sharp, pointing in all directions like the hands of broken clocks. But the snow at their roots had begun to retreat. Thin pools of water gathered in low places, and in them reflections trembled, not just of sky and branch, but of something deeper, something beneath. She had not returned to the chapel. There was no need. The sound had followed her home, folding itself into the fibers of her walls, the spaces between steps, the hush of her breath in the coldest part of night. It had become familiar, not comforting, no, but known, like the presence of a shadow cast always behind you, no matter the direction of the light. The others had heard it too. She saw it in their eyes, in the way they paused before speaking, in the way they held their children a little longer before letting them step outside. They did not talk of it. That would have been dangerous, not because of superstition, but because to name it would make it stay. And still, the cold did not vanish. It simply changed shape. There were signs. A patch of moss emerging green along the stones near the well. A bird, only one, seen resting on a roof beam before flying off toward the south. The ice on the pond began to crack, thin lines spreading like veins beneath a fragile skin. But no one trusted it, because something had shifted, because the winter had watched them, and because in the silence of its departure, it had left behind something that did not melt. One night, not long after, the woman dreamt of spring. Not the spring she knew, no flowers, no sun, no rivers in flood. Just warmth, a single breath of it, golden and endless. And in that breath, a voice, not hers, not anyone's, whispering a name she did not recognize, and yet understood completely. She woke before dawn. The fire had gone out. The room was cool but not frozen. She stood, stretched her limbs, and felt her knees pop like old branches. Outside, the wind stirred, not cruel, just present. She stepped out. The snow had receded to the edges of the path. The earth beneath was soft, dark, breathing. She knelt and placed her palm on it. Warm, not much, but enough. And as she stood again, the silence shifted. Not the silence of winter, not the silence of fear, but the silence of something that has passed through you and gone, leaving only the echo of its shape. She turned toward the trees. In the distance, a shadow moved among them. Slow, tall, not threatening, only watching. She did not wave. She did not run. She simply bowed her head once, closed her eyes, and listened, because winter, Once it knows your name, never truly leaves. It only waits, somewhere out there, beyond the thaw,